maybe you have, I don't know, a big interview coming up or something like that. So you've kind of divided your day up a little bit and you have a different technique for different situations. That's all good. That's not what I mean. Um, but we're doing at least one all day long. So that is the flashlight of our attention. One piece of it, or if it's like bandwidth, a certain percentage of it is on all the things that you're doing all day. And then you have another little piece of the bandwidth, even if it's a small piece, on the moment as it occurs. Does that make sense? That is the nuts and bolts of what we're learning to do with this entire system, is to shine the flashlight of attention on the moment as it occurs, to navigate with more presence. Which ultimately leads to one of the reasons that this system exists is adaptability. Adaptability is important so that the species can continue to evolve, so that the species can continue to exist. Adaptability is, as we go down, I'll actually show ways to set up adaptability. Now, it's kind of a checklist to see where you are, because if you're relaxed, if you're keeping to the middle, you are primed to adapt if necessary. You may not have anything to adapt to. It may be a perfectly sunny day or beautiful snow on the beach and not a care in the world, so you just didn't really have much to adapt to that day. Your kite in the sky, it's not very windy, enough wind to keep it up there perhaps, but not enough to throw it all over the place. But the idea is that ultimately hydrostasy will get a person to the point, two primary things. One, their attention is divided on what I call the second attention. And when we get to that topic, I'll explain why it's vitally important for the human species. And then number two is it puts a person in a position to be supremely adaptable. Both of those are really good things. And that's hydrostasy. That's what hydrostasy will do. By the time we get to hydrostasy, we have four primary features that we can begin to check into. And these are the four primary features that I begin to check into with deliberate modulation. So I'm going to combine the topics of deliberate modulation and sensing energy. So this is a continuation of last week. And then I have a new topic that I'm adding as topic 20. So the four things that I check into early in the morning. And now, if this was at the beginning of hydrostasy, this system would have irritated me, because one of the four aspects are more like results. So in hydrostasy and deliberate modulation, we're checking into these results that are occurring from our practice. When you pay attention to the results that are, and results, I'm using this in air quotes, this isn't a extremely result oriented. We're not focused, but things will occur. Like it's cause and effect. The cause of the effect is the Igong system. That's what causes the effect of. And so the first one is a peaceful mind. Why? Because we're creating space in the overall amount of thought. So there's just generally more peace in one's mind. Does that make sense? That's a pretty basic one. So that's one of the deliberate modulation points as well. Remember last week I also talked about appreciation through death is my advisor, stuff like that. So those are ones that I use as well. Those are also like tools that you can check in and check out, check in and check out. Again, as long as we got something going on, then we're going to be in our hydrostatic bubble, which is one of the topics that I call the hydrostatic effect, or macro smooth ebb and flow. Does that make sense so far? That's not okay. So we have the peaceful mind, a calm attitude. So a calm attitude is someone who's not bored, not at odds with the moment. If shit's just, popping and there's all kinds of stimuli and things are going crazy, you're cool as a cucumber. Then again, if absolutely nothing is going on and you're the only one sitting at a last stop desert gas station, you're cool as a cucumber. Does that make sense? I don't know why we talk about cucumbers being cool, but I don't know where that comes from. Why are cucumbers cooler than other vegetables? I don't know. But does that make sense? So I'll write these down. So these are two. So when we talk about deliberate modulation, this is a form of emotional memory, but it's also checking into our current state or the things that we're creating to highlight them, because when you highlight them, they gain more visceralness in your experience. They gain momentum. So it's a lot like, let's say Donna wanted to do something, like she had a physical goal. Maybe she wanted to run around the world. That's her goal. I don't know how she's going to do that on water, but she thought of a way. She's going to go on a ship on a treadmill. So while she's running on the treadmill, she's still technically walking. So she's going to walk around the whole world. That's her goal. And then she does it. And then a week later, she never thinks about it again. She never gives it energy. She never pays attention to it again. Now, she kind of missed an opportunity to highlight it, to get that emotion going, to get that feeling going. Like MP, what's that mean? MP, military police? Like Forrest Gump. Yeah, it's such a good movie too. So I'll write all of these down just to kind of give you an idea, but we'll get there. So hydrostasy begins when a person is capable, as a result of their practice, to hold at least one point of attention all day long. Was there any confusion about that? About that point before we move on to the rest of hydrostasy? A person can hold at least one point of attention all day long. Hopefully at this point, we would not consider that impossible. I think that there could be some people who at the beginning of the practice will look at that and just be like, are you sure? Like, is this even possible? It is. And what's the principle saying it's not possible? Where's the principle in the universe that says that a person can't learn to be deliberate with their attention at all times? Doesn't make sense. There's no principle in the universe that says that. There's no principle of the distracted mind that we need to be distracted at all. Okay, so we can hold at least one point of attention all day, and then we're going to do the same thing that we've been doing in our entire practice, and that is establish our four modes. Within, oh, okay. Let me change that. That's establish the four directions within the four modes. Sorry. Too many numbers that are similar. So this is something that we have been doing up until this point. And of course, because this practice builds on other things, we're doing the same thing. But we're not in hydrostasy technically until we can hold at least one point of attention all day. And now, with the four directions and the four modes, your direction of attention, at least one direction will be active at all times. If you have one point of attention active at all times, that's in one of your directions of attention automatically. So you will have at least one direction of attention active. Does that?
I don't know what, I know, I lost you on that one.
Which part?
This that last thing. If you've got one, you've got the other. I don't understand what you mean. Just give an example.
Well, your points of attention are in your four directions. So if you're holding an outside point of attention, an inside point of attention, breath, or cognition, deliberate cognition, you are in one of the four directions. So you can't really be doing this practice and not be in one of the four directions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Does everybody else get that? We're talking about four directions of attention. This is the four possible directions of attention, and you can bounce around between them. We have what we view as outside. That's using sensory attention training, your sensory organs. We have introspection, the feeling of your body, inside your body, using the peripheral nervous system. And other things. I'm just being general so that if there's any scientists watching this, they'll agree. We do have a peripheral nervous system. The breath is one of the points of attention that exist independently from the outside world and the inside world. Then again, it's working with both of them as well, because it comes from the outside world into the inside world. We never really see it. So it also has this type of abstract quality to it as well. And then the 4 directions within the 4 modes. So that means that you're doing at least one direction of attention anytime you're standing, sitting, walking, laying down, or you're in some transition between them. So this is setting up hydrostasy and how it's done. And I'm going to kind of make a little format chart that leads to deliberate modulation and sensing energy, which is the topics for today. Because I've combined those 2 topics because they go together really well. Any questions so far? So wherever you are in your practice, if you're in counterbalance, then we're forgetting our practice. And when we remember, we're using our rule of 3 and things like that to go back to what we're doing, to keep yourself in the practice. Or if you are out of the practice and you see stream and momentum of thought and it is violating one of your traps of attention, then you redirect using the rule of 3. Eventually in warrior training, you're redirecting any thought about yourself because it's actually quite inefficient to just sit there and think about yourself all the time. And we've already established that we don't have to think ourselves out of situations that we have created ourselves. All that makes sense? I could make a whiteboard. 4 modes is, and this will be in the Igong book as well. This is in the beginning of the Igong book because it's the beginning of the practice as well. It's just also a part of hydrostasy because it's a part of the entire practice. The 4 directions within the 4 modes. But we can make another whiteboard later or add to this one that kind of explains that.
So the 4 modes is sitting,
Mhm.
laying down, standing, walking. And the 4 directions are internal, external, breath, and a cognition, mantra, something like that.
Yep, and you can have multiple points in the same direction to a certain extent. Now, what your mind is really doing is bouncing back and forth. That's okay. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. If your mind is rapidly going from shadows to the directions of light to the sounds of the world, that's all technically external. That's okay. You're still doing a deliberate point of attention. No worries there. Now, when it comes to maintaining multiple points of attention, it will get tricky if all of your attention is in one direction. We'll look to balance the 4 directions. Does that make sense? Did you get that, Jerry? Does that
You
make
mean if
sense?
you're using your sight predominantly, okay, I'm looking at colors, I'm
Mhm.
looking at the changing light, I'm looking at then you're all in an P1, an external point of
You're all in
attention.
external point of attention, and then all
And then it
visual on
becomes
top of that.
imbalanced.
It
You
can become
need,
imbalanced, yeah.
okay.
And the way that it becomes imbalanced is it doesn't feel as useful because you're in the same direction. So it's harder to expand and gain that what we're going to get to in hydrostasy. So we're moving towards something that if your direction of attention is imbalanced to just one direction all the time, you're still going to benefit, but what I'm talking about later will be more difficult. Does that make sense? And I got to build up to that, but I will. The reason we want the P1 and the P2 is because it will have an effect, and that effect we can pay attention to. That effect would be less likely if all of our attention is just in one direction all the time. Makes sense?
And then you said you were talking about if it's bouncing around from light and shadows and so on and so forth. You said, yeah, sure, get that. And then you said, but what you just said just now, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reiterating. It's going to make it difficult when it is in one. I need clarification or something.
Well,
I'm not sure I follow.
I have techniques that I will offer later that require a balance between the 4 modes. Now, if you are not interested in those techniques and you're just bouncing around, you're still going to be present. You're still going to be very mind management. And if you're in hydrostasy, then you're still maintaining a point of attention. You're going to be all right. Life will still be good. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but some of the stuff that I'm talking about in terms of the second attention, in terms of proprioception, things like that, we really need to charge all 4 directions. Does that make sense, Jerry? So I wouldn't say that you're doing anything
Yeah.
wrong, but unless we balance the 4 directions, it's going to be very difficult to do what I'm setting up. For example, the 3 convergences of breath. I borrowed that from Dan Brule, so I'm giving credit to where I took the term from. Dan Brule, Just Breathe. You can't see it because it's blurred. But he has what he calls the 3 convergences of breath. I completely agree with him, although this book sucks because it doesn't tell you how to do it at all, 1 iota. But I will. So we'll get to the physical relaxation, the awareness of breath without manipulating, and then eventually a breath that uses the least amount of accessory muscle tension throughout the day. And that will have an effect that adds to the hydrostasy effect towards the end. Does that make sense? And that will be the last topic when I put all of that together. And that will explain my practice and what I'm doing to a very large extent. That is my practice. And it will be my practice until I'm 110.
And you said that book is coming out next.
Well, the next book is Qigong, just basic alignment. So we have a long way to go before we get into the hydrostasy books.
Oh, I thought you said something about.
No, the reason that Qigong is taking a little bit longer is because I'm adding fox walking, and I'm also adding the posture, which I am having a little bit of a block. I hit a wall a little bit with the posture because the type of book that I'm writing, it doesn't lend very well to pictures. So I kind of have to find a way to get a picture in there, because if we're talking about posture, I need the picture of a person to kind of show where these points are that you check and go, check and go, check and go. Does that make sense? So that's what's the holdup with the Qigong book. But the Qigong book will be accompanied by a new Qigong website. I'm getting rid of eKrolik.com. I don't want any focus to be on Ernest. This has nothing to do with me. It's about the system. It's about the practice. It's about how it can benefit. And ultimately, it could be one of the many keys. So I'm going to allow other things to exist that lend to a similar goal, but it could be one of the keys to the evolution of our species, is learning to engage our mind deliberately.
May I ask a question about that now?
Yes.
We were talking one day about the book. Oh, it was in the room or your page. And I said, oh, I look forward to reading that. And you said, well, it's not really a reading book. It's more an instructional. So if there's no pictures, wouldn't it be reading? Mostly reading.
It is mostly reading, but when I said that, it's not like a novel. It's not like something you would want to read from cover to cover necessarily, just in like one sitting or in 2 days, because it's a practice book. So it's the kind of book that you would keep in your pocket, and well, you'd need big pockets, but you'd keep it with you, and you would reference it often, and you're probably going to take notes, and you're going to, so it's more of a manual type of book, like my acupuncture book, the one with the spiral bound, that's a manual. I wouldn't want to read that cover to cover. I mean, I could, I probably will, but that's not how it's necessarily intended. So that's kind of what I meant. Okay, so now we start to get into the gates of seeing, because eventually we start to maintain multiple directions. And I'll put that here. And that's one of the reasons we don't want to spend too much time in one direction. And these are hydrostasy things, at the beginning of the practice or in the middle of the practice, it doesn't matter as long as you're doing it. But eventually we will want to maintain multiple directions. Notice in hydrostasy, I'll use the word maintain quite a bit, because this is about maintaining something. We're not just counterbalancing all the time. Counterbalance can come up because we live in a weird world, but it should definitely have a different feel to it now. It's not really remembering and forgetting as much. You're remembering almost all the time, if not all the time. And the way that we maintain multiple points of attention is we start to maintain multiple directions. That's the best way to maintain multiple points of attention, is to have them in a different direction, and then you can more easily hold them. Does that make sense? If they're all in the same direction, it gets very difficult to hold multiple points because your mind is actually just kind of going back and forth. And this is going to have an effect. The effect of maintaining multiple points of attention will equal cognitive space, because you're doing something else so much with so much focus and attention and commitment that the stream of thought especially loses its momentum. Eventually, the trickle of thought will lose its momentum. And then before you know it, the only thing you have are short bursts of beneficial thinking, better ways to communicate, better ways to organize your own information. But language will be fundamentally around creating concepts in order to communicate them, in order to gain knowledge, at least one aspect of knowledge, which is information. Are we cool so far? Is this all making sense?
Yes, and I just want to clarify for myself out loud that when you said make space, I was thinking of creating more capacity. And although that does happen, that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about there's a thought or there's a focus, and then but the overall amount of what's going on in there has slowed so that though there's a lot of distance, there's a lot of space between thoughts going through your head.
Yes.
So
Yes.
when you're creating more space, it's not necessarily making more room for more stuff, for more thoughts. It's between the thoughts, there is an enormous amount of space. And when you say engage the space, you're talking about the space between the thoughts, not the giant space that I have to expand my bubble of perception to Pleiades. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about the space in your overall amount of thinking.
And that, yes, and that the reason I say engage the space is because it feels like your physical brain, like your mind just has more space. It feels lighter. We do start to get into some of these words that are very common in the world, such as enlightenment. Human beings have a very weird way of taking a word and making it like this stage of ultimate level, I don't know what, but really chances are what people were attempting to describe with any word and all words is a feeling. And so when we talk about peace, that's a feeling, the feeling of a mind that's not at war with itself. When we talk about enlightenment, that's a feeling, the feeling of not being encumbered, the lightness that comes when you're not creating psychological dramas. Shayna, can I have more coffee if it's available? I haven't had much yet. And then so Donna, I guess she jumped ahead there. Well, no, not really, I guess, because I talked about it, but that's the next little box, is to engage the space. Because what a shame would it be if we created the space and then never engaged it? We want to engage it because it will grow, the feeling will become more familiar. And the more that you engage the space, the easier it is to find it, the easier it is to create it. And it feels literally in your head. Like you can feel the lightness in the front of your forehead. You can notice that some days I don't have any wrinkle right here in my forehead. Some days I do. It just depends. But for the most part, I can create a lot of space here in my mind. My temples feel more relaxed. So there's a physical relaxation that occurs with the cognitive relaxation, of course. Hey, thanks. And engaging the space is what I also call the first gate of seeing, because you can't see shit if you don't create space to see it. None of the techniques that I'm going to talk about are possible or recommended until you have created the space. Deliberate modulation is not deliberate modulation unless you've created space. It's something else. Because if you haven't created the space, you're very likely just trying to change your emotions. But if you have created the space, you're at peace. So you might as well just go create what the hell you want to create, because it's your world, it's your life, it's your mind. And of course, in Qigong, I will line some things up for you. Are you with me so far? All of this is pretty simple. So once we go, and I'm going to make the next two, but they can arise mutually. They can also arise independently. You can have them to, oh no, I want that to come back. Okay. You can have, I said that so serious. Oh no, like I'd really lost something. So engage the space, which will lead to, I'm going to make it a bigger box because these two really do go together. And I can explain them separately. They can exist separately, but they really do belong happily together. And then that song went through my head, at least for a millisecond, happy together. But it would be deliberate modulation, which is the topic of today. Deliberate modulation and sensing energy, because I put them together. So this is kind of a continuation of last week then. So that means you have one more week with me on Tuesday. If you want. Deliberate modulation, and I'll make this bigger so it will fit. And what I call sensing energy. Now, I'm talking to the scientist who's rewatching this video, deliberate modulation is a form of emotional memory. Sensing energy is a way to process memory using more than just words. We're using our experience. We're processing memory using the more total experience rather than just trying to use words. So we are working with regular memory. Memory needs to be processed. Does that make sense? There are more ways of looking at it than just emotional memory. But if I were talking to the scientist, that's all I would say. I wouldn't talk about vibration and stuff like that because, you know, that conversation with that person wouldn't be well received. We need something a little bit more scientific to discuss, and memory is a great one. We've done lots of experiments on memory. We know that the human experience is absolutely dependent on memory and imagination, but we could talk about that in a little bit. So deliberate modulation, sensing the essence. What I'm talking about, if you're confused because you haven't really, you know, been in this level or excuse me, this layer of the training, I get it. I just have to emphasize that deliberate modulation and sensing into the moment to imprint it into your memory, your emotional memory, your energetic memory, your physical memory, your muscle memory. The way that you do that is with a clear mind, a mind that is already at peace. Does that make sense? That's why engaging the space is the first gate. Because if you do these other things, I don't know what's going to happen because I don't know what was going on in your mind before you decided to deliberately modulate. Because remember, one of the primary principles of what I have put together is non-interference. We're not trying to control, manipulate, change, anything like that. We're looking to get out of the way, which is engaging the space. That means you've gotten out of the way. Does that make sense? That's what we mean, getting out of the way. Your mind it has more space because the running stream of internal self-talk has been interrupted with the other things that you're doing with your cognitive attention. Easy peasy? Yes, William. It's coffee time too. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, I just questioning. I've been listening for a while, but I want to the question about. I don't know how to phrase my question, but it's about the benefit of the things you're doing if you haven't created peace. And that's the way I'm not clear on that because I wonder what I wonder what does that mean how does a person, I know that making space, I'm understanding that making space in the overall thinking of the thoughts and peace are related.
100%, yes.
Okay, so that I think that is the way I have to look at that because I think that what it is it's not I think sometimes when I hear the word, when I think of people at peace, I have some other associations with it that aren't as defined as making space in the overall amount of thinking and then engaging, because it's almost like saying that when you're engaging in space, you're engaging peace. It's like, there's a relationship to those two. But anyway, that was my question, because I was saying that if a person, and this is the thing with deliberate modulation and trying to understand non-interference, and so meaning in the morning, you first get up and you know that's a battleground for whatever thing that may be happening, but you deliberately modulate it at time. You go into your state of gratitude and appreciation, and you're you're in a sense, and I don't know if I'm just blurring the words here as you use them, but you're engaging the space with this gratitude and with this deliberate focus on appreciation for whatever things that you start them that offer your mind with, whether it be your health, your body, your home, whatever it is that you're going. But it's not necessarily that there's a negative emotion that you're countering, but you're putting yourself in that space. So, and it's not, I don't want to look at it like it's to avoid going into the other things, but at the same time, that if you don't create that, if you don't modulate towards that, then whatever else can come along will come along. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does. That does make sense to me. Yeah.
So how does that correlate with non-interference? Meaning that I'm not interfering. I'm not trying to reset something that exists already, but I know that if I don't give myself a deliberate attention, then my mind may end up in some other places that is not empowering to me.
Yeah. So the non-interference, so I'll back it up. So first, the way that I use the word peace must include the word war. If we're using these, I hope that there's a society someday that doesn't use these words, because they haven't created the opposite. There's no contextual reference. We just have no use for the word peace because we haven't created war. So when we're talking about the mind, the war is the thoughts that we're thinking about ourselves, about our problems, about what we need to fix. And what we've fundamentally declared war on is the present moment. We're no longer paying attention to the moment. We're no longer engaging the moment. Our mind is starting to fall below the threshold of active recognition the more that we launch into these thoughts, and it creates a wide variety of different emotional derivatives. If this is occurring, hydrostasy is completely inaccessible. We should go right back to counterbalance. We should go back to the rule of three. We have to create that space first before we do anything else in hydrostasy. So creating the space is, you can imagine that for the vast majority of our lives, there's been a stream of words running across the screen of our mind. Well, creating space is, because we're doing our 4 directions within our 4 modes. So I wake up, I do my 4 directions, I engage my 4 directions, my different points of attention. And that includes breath. That's one of the directions. That includes something exterior, something interior. And I have a form of cognition. Sometimes it's imagination. Sometimes it is certain types of things towards the end of hydrostasy that I'll talk about later. So I wake up, I engage my practice, and it's the practice that creates the space, because I'm doing something else so much. That's the mindfulness slider, because I'm engaging things deliberately so much with my cognition below the level, or below the threshold of active recognition. Continuous street, they don't stand a chance. They don't have the energy that they need to exist. I'm not giving them what they need. And if we're in hydrostasy, we've been doing this probably for a very long time, so we're getting more familiar with this process. So step 1, engage our directions of attention. If we're in hydrostasy, it'll be very quick before we can feel that space in the mind. So I literally mean it feels like space inside of your brain, because we're not, the thinking causes the energy to come up. It causes the head to tense. The more that we're thinking, we're creating forms of micro tension in our brain and in our head and in our shoulders and in our neck. And if we continue to do it, our whole body gets tense. That's all interference. Every single aspect of that is a form of interference. So non-interference means we only need to do one thing: create the space. and everything else will start to occur naturally. I can help guide, but our behaviors will start to change. Our relationships will start to change with ourselves and with others will start to change. Everything will naturally start to smoothen in terms of the flow of energy, because the only thing really interrupting the flow of energy is our own cognition, the way that we're thinking, the amount that we're thinking. So non-interference means just cognitively getting out of the way. And that's why later in the system, there's never boot camp for habits. Habits will start to fall away because of the way that we're paying attention to ourselves. We start to pay attention to what feels good, what doesn't feel good. We start to identify things as destroyers, not good, not bad. It's just the destroyer's holding the kite string right now. That's the reason I'm looking at this person the way that I'm looking at them. It's the biological destroyer. You know, it's a thing. I'm not, you know, I don't need to get down on myself for it. I just need to use my rule of 3 and redirect back to my practice and, you know, keep going down my road. So engage the space. So as soon as I wake up, I engage my directions of attention. By maintaining them even for a little while, my mind starts to clear. That's peace. A mind that is no longer at war with itself. That will create inner peace. And guess what? That creates outer peace as well. That's an example of non-interference. I don't have to go around trying to create peace in my life. All I need to do is get out of the way and peace will occur. I don't have to try to figure out all of these ways to be healthy. Get out of the way and health will start to come into our lives on its own. Because a lot of the ways that we eat, a lot of the ways that we behave, a lot of the ways that we interact with other people are all because we're causing interference in the flow of our energy. If we look at it from a Tai Chi perspective, we have heaven, earth, and human. It's the cognitive that is interfering with that connection between those 3. And I know that's a little different, but let's look at this. When we talk about adaptation, what do we ever have to adapt to? And I'll erase this because it's not a part of the flow chart. But let's say one of the most obvious things that we ever have to adapt to is outside situations. A tornado, you know, there's a tsunami on the way, you know, that's an outside situation. Does that, and that's going to be the most common thing that we think of at first in terms of what we need to adapt to in our life. Let's go ahead and just say that we do need to adapt to our own biology. We're aging, we have predispositions, we have DNA, so, you know, we're all going to have our things to experience. I had a predisposition towards alcoholism. So alcohol really messed with me in a weird way. And it's something that I learned to kind of stay away from. And I don't really, but that's my adaptation. Maybe William doesn't have that in his family. You know, he doesn't have that predisposition. So that's not something he'll ever need to really, well, maybe he will, I don't know, but innately, it's not something that he would need to adapt to. So we do need to adapt to our own biology. We do need to adapt to outside situations. But what most people are doing is they're creating an area that they need to adapt to their own psychology. Does that make sense? That's what most people, it's their psychology is what's creating the thing that they think they need to adapt to. Because there's nothing going on in my immediate environment. My body feels good. So what do I need to adapt to in this moment? Sometimes there's nothing. There's nothing really, you know, it's just a little ebb and flow, kite in the sky type of thing. We're surfing. That's cool. But the number one thing that we have to adapt to, or the number one thing creating the things that we need to adapt to, or we think we need to adapt to at least, is our own psychology. So our mind is creating the vast majority of any type of difficulty. The dishes aren't difficult. Your mind is making it difficult. Does that make sense? And so when we create the space, that's because our practice, that element isn't there anymore. The energy is allowed to flow. Deliberate modulation is a way to stay in hydrostasy. Does that make sense? And so I would point out that this is where I deliberately modulate, and in the system, when you get the Qigong book, when we get to hydrostasy, The deliberate modulation portion are the derivatives of the first 3 layers of training. So the first 3 layers of training, especially if you're engaging the space, your mind is more relaxed. You have a relaxed mind. So number 1, peace of mind. And we already know, and this is actually the perfect example of non-interference. If your mind is at peace, you have a infinitely better chance of just naturally having peace in the rest of your life. You're not angry with people, you're not getting upset with people, you're not competing with people, you're not jealous of people. So the only violence that could come into your life, chances are, is just some random act. And that's a situation that we have to be ready to adapt to. Not try to control, not try to predict. I know we've seen this in Tai Chi where you have people that are attempting to train for every single scenario under the sun. And then what actually occurs in their life is the one scenario that they didn't train for. So it's better to train for adaptation than to necessarily try to, that's like when you go into a speech, or if I were to go in a speech, I would have some bullet points and I would just adapt the whole time rather than trying to create exactly what I'm going to say when I'm going to say it. That's a lot like the martial artist trying to predict every potential scenario and train for every potential scenario under the sun. If you enjoy that type of thing, great. But if you're trying to do that because you think you need to, that could be erroneous. Does that make sense? So if we're doing the Qigong system and we have gotten to the point where we can create space in the overall amount of thought, then we have a type of mental peace that we can pay attention to. That can be a point of deliberate modulation. And what you're doing is you're putting your attention on that peace, and that peace will grow. You'll feel that peace more and more and more, and it will get easier to just direct your mind to that peace. Does that make sense? You become more familiar with it. You become more comfortable with it. You know what it feels like and what it doesn't feel like. Just like deliberate mind. If we pay attention to the coffee cup and I decide to pay attention to it for 13 seconds with peripheral vision, I know what that feels like in comparison to a mind that's just a leaf at the mercy of the wind. That has a completely different feeling. And I can engage that feeling to become more acquainted with it so that it will grow in my experience. It becomes more accessible. It's easier to access. And then before you know it, I can just modulate my mind almost instantly to peace. Does that make sense? That feeling, it's more of a feeling that we're feeling, a mind that's not at war with itself. And this is one of the ways that I would be able to gauge whether a person is practicing at this point or not, because number 2 is a calm attitude. And this is kind of I guess this is kind of a generic way of talking about it, calm attitude, but I don't know, it fits. Maybe I'll have a more scientific way of explaining it later, but you know, if Donna were sitting there and she was visibly anxious, she was pulling at her hair, she was biting her lip, she is not in a calm state. And I would want to know, well, no, I don't want to know unless she wants to tell me, but where's that coming from? And I don't mean like we need to go into the psychological evaluation. No. I mean, where is your mind now? And did you put it there? And if your mind is deliberate, if you did put it there could be something physically going on that's causing that anxious state that maybe we need to adapt to that. You know what I mean? You maybe even go to the doctor because something is about to happen. You know what I mean? If it's coming from absolutely nowhere, that could be an indication of some sort of imbalance in your body. That would be very rare. Most of the time, if she's in that situation or if a person's in that situation, it's because their mind is not settled. So does that make sense? So at the clinic, when, you know, things are going awry, you know, we have multiple appointments showing up for some reason. One of the practitioners isn't on time, so we have a patient waiting. That's pretty much extent of the drama at the clinic. If I go back into other jobs that I've had, in the kitchen, for example, you got people trying to kill each other. You have people trying to have sex in the kitchen. You have all kinds of crazy shit that you need to adapt to in the average Denny's kitchen or something like that. So I could give many more examples of adaptation in that example, but does that make sense so far? So if I'm in a calm state, it's because of the peaceful mind. They are synonymous with one another. But I can't say, Donna, I have a very peaceful mind, although I just can't sit still and I just can't wait for tomorrow and I'm all over the place. No, I'm not judging you. I'm just telling you that you are not in this hydrostatic state of being. It doesn't exist for you right now, and that's okay, but it doesn't. Does that make sense? These are derivatives. These are characteristics, right? If you tell me that you can squat 400 pounds, but you have little skinny thighs, I'm gonna be like, something isn't adding up here. You know, it doesn't quite make sense. So if you're all anxious and giddy or really emotional and upset, then you are not in a calm attitude. We probably need to trace our practice back, very likely to counterbalancing some thoughts about ourselves, which is why this practice will always be valid. You know, I'm going to have something in my life that I have to back my practice up and go back to the rule of three. I use the rule of three in hydrostasy, but I'll talk about that another time. It's a different quality of the rule of three. It's a little bit different. Same thing, but different. So does this make sense so far? Okay. I'm going to add a couple more. So we have peace of mind, a calm attitude, 3, and these do seem very relatable, almost as if they're the same thing. So you can put on a fake calm attitude, though you're emotionally in turmoil inside. Men do that all the time. I'm sure women do it too, but we know that men historically, you're not allowed to have emotion. You're not allowed to express yourself. You're not allowed to cry. You know, when I told you that I'm much softer than I used to be, you know, that's a statement that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have wanted to make about myself. You know, I'm not soft. That's not manly. You know, I'm not too concerned with that kind of thing anymore. So that's an example that a person can put on that they're in a calm state of mind, though emotionally inside they're going through roller coasters. They're sometimes maybe wound tight like a towel, just waiting to unwind, or, you know, there's other things internally that they're suppressing. Anything that you suppress eventually will build and blow up. That's just the way it works. And at no point is this practice in any way, shape, or form suppression. We're not burying our head in the sand. We're putting ourselves in the optimal position to adapt to life's challenges. But most of the challenges that people are experiencing are also challenges that they're creating through their own cognition. Because if your basement isn't flooding, if there's not a tornado, if somebody isn't trying to punch you, chances are you have very little physically to adapt to. All right, and then last but certainly not least, so we have a peaceful mind, which lends to a calm attitude, which lends to a balanced emotional state, and all of this is because impeccable, I spelled that wrong. I think it might have 2 C's. Impeccable self-awareness. This would mean that if you're in this layer of training, and remember, this is deliberate modulation, so I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to highlight my impeccable self-awareness. I'm modulating, and there will be feelings, you know, emotional derivatives, vibrational derivatives, and we may talk about them a little differently. What does peace feel like to you? Maybe, you know, Ida would talk about that light snow in Ireland that just doesn't happen very often and how peaceful that made her. That could be a way that she explains it. For Jerry, she could have a different explanation. For me, I could have a different explanation, you know, watching traffic go by and I'm just sitting there on the counter having my cup of jasmine tea. You know, that's how I would explain what that peace feels like, you know, because the more that we talk about some of these feelings, the less we have good words for them. That's why we need abstract things like poetry and art and painting and books and stuff like that. Because it gets very tricky to talk about because we all have individual experiences. That's one of the principles of the system, is the principle of the hawk. You have only ever your entire life been dancing around in your own head. You've never danced in anybody else's. All right. So these are the initial stages or the initial aspects of deliberate modulation that I will recommend in Qigong. Now, there can be other things, just like the bridge, you can do other things than Qigong. This is Qigong though. This is what I'll map out for people when we do the hydrostasy books. There'll be 3 hydrostasy books because there's a lot going on. So I have my 4 directions of attention. That is multiple points of attention. Eventually, we want to maintain all 4 directions simultaneously. Now, that sounds heavy, but it is possible with practice that we can maintain. That's why I have the 4 directions, so that you're not rapidly going back and forth. You're able to establish all 4 simultaneously. That will create an immeasurable amount of space in your mind. Well, so that we're not just sitting there with idle mind, we engage the space and we can deliberately modulate. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions about that before we go into sensing energy? What does that mean? And I would point out that the technique for deliberate modulation is a lot like the rule of 3. I will rule of 3 myself with the peace of mind, in a manner of speaking, because I have my directions of attention. I may even use words just to remind myself, wow, Ernest, your mind is really peaceful. When that happens, my mind gets more peaceful because it's a deliberate form of cognition. It's not going to go into a rabbit hole because I'm just reminding myself, this feels really good. It's really nice to have a mind that is so flexible, so dynamic, so easy to move, so hard to offend. And I'll remind myself of these things. And it's almost like a rule of 3. Does that make sense? All right, so with sensing energy, once again, it is impossible, as far as I'm concerned, the way that I'm using the words, without creating the space. Because without creating the space, without the peace and those deliberate modulation elements, what are you really sensing into? Probably your own emotional turmoil mixed with the present moment. Does that make sense? Now, what is sensing energy? It's going to be different for everybody, and I'm going to set up some things, some ways that we can sense into things, and that'll be a part of the Qigong book. But the natives of pretty much every land on Earth, masters in air quotes, I don't know what that means for them, of antiquity, very likely all of them spoke about this element of, and this is getting to the abstract quality of things. You may notice that all of it is kind of leading to this abstract quality. And by abstract, I mean not literal. It's not something that we can quite, grasp with our hands or see with our eyes necessarily, although you can see it with your eyes. It's a funny circle of chasing your tail, but it does make sense once you're doing it. So the idea is that I have my mind clear. I'm engaging the world around me with the 4 directions. It starts to speak to you. Have you ever heard the silence speaks? So ultimately, these natives of antiquity, these masters, they would look at a mountain and they would give the mountain characteristics. And then they would try to themselves embody those characteristics, and they would even get nicknames from it. It would be Ernest the Mountain. Why do they call you that? Because I'm strong and firm and unmovable like a mountain. Or they would call me Ernest the River because you're a snake. You're sneaky like a little snaking river or something. Hopefully not that, but you get the idea. An elegant crane, exactly. Yeah. So the idea is that with sensing energy, what we're doing is we're clearing our mind, and we're paying attention. Well, because we're paying attention to the present moment, our mind clears. And because we're engaging the moment with our different directions of attention, we start to gain new emotions from it, emotional soups. Does that make sense? Because we're having an emotional response to what? To our practice, to what we're doing in the present moment. So when I walk outside, Chicago is always new for me. There's just some new element every single time that I walk inside the clinic. It always has this quality to it because the quality isn't good, it isn't bad, it's not aging, it's timeless. Does that make sense? And you can start to feel into the energy quality of an area. The interesting thing is it could be completely different for William Miller than it is for me. He could walk in the clinic and just say, this place is shitty. I hate it. It gives me a terrible feeling. Donna could come in and just say, wow, this is just like the most freeing, bright space I've ever been in. Chances are it won't be that diametrically opposite if they're both in hydrostasy or they're both doing this practice. It will be somewhat similar, but this is the principle of the hawk. It will also be different. One thing that we're doing now, the further we get in the system, is we can't look at opposites as existing independently anymore. So it will be fundamentally unique and pretty darn similar. And then you're like, wait, what? Like, how can it be similar yet completely unique? It is. Opposites start to lose their momentum the further we get into this hydrostatic practice, because the opposites are created through the cognition, the way that we think about things. And I know I won't say this in my acupuncture program, but I do not think that the universe is binary. The mind is binary, so all it sees is yin and yang. There is much more than that. Of course, in traditional Chinese medicine, the world, the universe was one, and then it became two, and then it became 10,000. That's all good. That's an excellent story to tell your kids at night. All right, any questions about these two things so far? And so this is setting up what I would call the fourth, or where am I at? Which gate is this? Oh, that's not even a gate. These are just the cores of the practice: deliberate modulation and sensing the essence. That will lead to the second gate of attention, the second gate of seeing that I call dream walking, which is a topic 17. So we still have a few more to go. The hydrostatic effect, the enemies of knowledge. We get even more into non-interference. The next topic is probably one of the juiciest, but the next topic next week is the 5 destroyers.
So can you please differentiate how you define deliberate modulation as differing from sensing energy, as one is creating memory and the other is the way we process memory? Can you explain that?
Well, if you don't want to use memory, you could just use like emotional states, vibrational states, however you want to talk about it. But one is already familiar, and you're choosing to put your mind there. You're choosing to put your enemy, or your energy, not your enemy. Hopefully you have no enemies at this point, but you choose to put your energy where you want it to be. You're not interfering with anything. You're coming from a place of peace and relaxation, and you're just making a choice. You have to make choices all the time. Where to put your mind is just another choice that you're making, right? Sensing energy, you're open to new things. You're open to processing different things that you'll be able to recall later. So often, I'll just say that these happen accidentally. They just happen on their own. You'll be walking somewhere and you have the clear mind, you're practicing, you have your multiple directions, and then all of a sudden this feeling, typically very childlike, because when we're younger we have less interference. We're not interfering as much because we haven't learned to do that as much. So typically, like, we'll get these feelings of freedom and what it's like to be a kid, and it may even be associated with a specific memory of when you were a kid. Sometimes it's kid, and then that's why I go to that, because that's typically when our mind is more free, but not for everybody. Some people had very traumatic childhoods, and so they're not going to associate childhood to freedom and stuff like that. So it would be different for them. Does that make sense? And then the sensing energy, maybe you're going on vacation and you just want to be totally open to all of the things that are coming in, and the things that feel really good. You just want to take a little snapshot and imprint it so that you can feel it another time if you want to. Does that make sense? So I have some things that I deliberately modulate to, but I can't share them with you because I'm not going to say unique to me, but I have no way to tell you how to get there because it comes from a memory of when I was a kid. I don't know how you can get there. That's my memory. That's how I felt when I was, 9 years old out playing football on the concrete. That's how I feel. I can't share that with you. That's me. That's the nature. But the other ones that I shared earlier, those ones will be common between anybody who's practicing this practice. Does that make sense? And this will set up a lot of stuff. So as we continue through the practice, I'm still not sure on the term alchemy, but we do start to transform everything internally, externally. Our whole life is transforming, and that's why before we called it transcendental embodiment approach, because it is transcendental. Like the more you do this practice, especially in hydrostasy, it gains so much momentum at that point. Everything starts to become more clear because you have impeccable self-awareness. You know so much. When know thyself, that's just not what do you want for dinner? What is your favorite color? That's not that. I don't think that's what Marcus Aurelius, is that who? I don't think that's what they meant when they said know thyself. I think that really means pay attention to yourself in real time. So you know more about yourself if you're paying attention to yourself as you exist. So does this all make sense? Because that's pretty much the gist of deliberate modulation and sensing energy. It's the gist. It can get a little bit more fun when you're doing it. But let's say I wake up sad, or I wake up, maybe I had too much to eat and I had heartburn all night and I wake up grumpy. I am not going to try to modulate to not grumpy. Chances are I need to just kind of go back to the earlier steps in my practice, because if I'm grumpy, I'm going to have a predisposition towards grumpiness, grumpy thoughts, grumpy actions, because that's my mood. So I'm not going to try to deliberately modulate to the opposite of grumpy. I'm just going to clear my mind, engage my 4 directions. If I need to, I'll rule of 3 any thoughts about myself or other. I'll go back to my points of attention. I'll really engage them. I'll create space. And then the grumpy will change on its own. And then when the grumpy isn't there as much, then I can deliberately modulate to whatever I want. And that's not a form of interference. That's choosing. That's just choosing the direction you want to walk on the sidewalk or down the road, or you have multiple paths. You're not interfering with your walk because you choose to go left or right. You're just choosing which direction you want to go. And we are creators first and foremost. So is everything on earth, all life is a creator. So it's not like humans are special. Everybody is creating something. Everybody has attention, whether it's deliberate or not. So we're all doing the exact same thing. It's just with this practice, we're adding the element of deliberate nature, on purpose, intentional, because I wanted to. And that's the whole mind, deliberate cognition. I'll highlight this real quick, and then I could open it up to any other questions, comments, or concerns. And then, of course, as I deliver the Igong book, there'll be more technique around how to do this, how to do sensing energy, how to do the deliberate modulation, much like the rule of 3. But I'm going to draw this picture again, just to remind you of what is occurring in the human experience. I'll save this actually, and I'll start over. If there's one thing I understand, sorry, Socrates, I'm not just going to pretend to know nothing. I know a few things. Is the human experience. Like, I really can just see what is occurring in the human experience. It's there for all of us to see, but of course, seeing implies that you've gotten out of your own way in order to get past the obstruction. What is behind the obstruction of our mind? Well, you don't know until you can get the obstruction out of the way. But this is the bubble of perception. Okay, so in this picture, and the bubble of perception becomes absolutely essential to the end of hydrostasy, and basically what I do with my mind and how I interact with my own experience, and you can take that for what it's worth. You know, we don't all have to do the same thing. Heaven forbid, you're hopefully not trying to be like me, because again, this has nothing to do with me. But this is the bubble of perception. In this bubble of perception is your taste, your touch, your smell, your sight, your sound. Proprioception is the best way to increase this bubble of perception, but that's your bubble of perception. Does that make sense? So if we're doing our practice, we're engaging this bubble of perception, whether it's internally or externally, inside the body or outside the body. Now, the interesting thing is people are engaging their bubble of perception below the threshold of active recognition. That's how they can drive to work but not remember the drive. They can do activities and then you say, what are you doing? And they have no idea. I was at the theater slapping myself with a rubber band. I thought that would be a good way to remind myself until it became a habit. And then someone's like, Ernest, what are you doing? And I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, you're snapping your wrist with the rubber band. I'm like, oh shit, I am. I didn't even realize that. I was still engaging my bubble of perception below the threshold of active recognition. Does that make sense? You would have to be dumb, deaf, and blind, but even then you have a bubble of internal perception. And maybe even some outside, I don't know. I don't know how all that works. However, that's not what humans are doing. So first of all, the vast majority of our activity, the vast majority of our cognition is below the threshold of active recognition. When it's above the threshold of active recognition, people love it. You know, when you're playing sports, when you're having a very, engaged sexual encounter, people love to be present. They just don't realize it. They just don't really understand what's going on. But does that make sense? The bubble of perception. It always exists unless you're in a dreamless sleep. If you just got knocked out, you are in a dreamless sleep. Your cognition is nil at this point. But when you're in a dream, you're paying attention to your dream. So attention exists at all times outside of a dreamless sleep or dead. Sorry, if it's funny to me, sorry if that's not funny to you. Okay, so what are humans doing? They're creating two bubbles. And these bubbles, while I'm drawing them on the inside just for the sake of the picture, they're much, much bigger than the bubble of perception. These are the two things that you're doing with your mind if you're not present, in air quotes, present. What does it mean to be present? Well, I don't really like the word presence. I don't even really like the phrase present moment. You see how singular that is, how still that sounds? The mind is constantly creating a snapshot, just like a picture. It's trying to take the moving present moment and hold it still for just a second so that it can find safety and understanding. And then before you know it, it's like, okay, I get it, this moment. And then, but it's already changed. It's already 30, 40, 50 minutes down the road. And it's like, oh shit, I have a whole new moment to adapt to and get acquainted with. Does that make sense? So I don't even like the term present moment. Yes.
What do you want to call it? What are you calling it?
I just don't have a good phrase for it yet, Jerry. But if you could imagine a line.
I mean, for conversation, when we're talking in class,
we'll just call it the present moment.
Present moment. I mean, that's,
yeah, you can call it that.
The word we use.
Mm-hmm. I don't see it like that. I don't feel it like that. So I don't think that it's the most accurate description of what's going on, because there is no such thing as a present moment. The moment is always moving. It's always changing. It's always transforming. So there's never a...
You like presence better? Because presence
yeah.
is something that can move.
Yeah.
With.
Yeah, presence. Okay, not the point. This is what the human mind is doing if it's not engaging the world around us. These two bubbles get so big that it has displaced the human species. As a species, we are completely displaced because of these two bubbles. These are not the bubbles of perception. Thought. We create thought bubbles. And that thought bubble will remove you from the present moment, unless you're doing it deliberately in the, as a rule of three, and it's emphasizing your present moment. So does the first bubble make sense? thought. That's what's removing you from the present moment. The present moment. You're not paying attention to the movement around you. Does that make sense? You can only be doing one of these two things, if not both of them. There's nothing else you're doing with your mind ever. Yep, thought like rabbit holes, or just thinking all the time. Doesn't matter what you're thinking. I had creative thoughts and that bubble got too big. There were too many creative thoughts. I couldn't do anything with all of them all at the same time. I was forgetting some of them. It was just too much. I got too creative. It got imbalanced. If I would have sustained that imbalance, who knows what that could have led to. Now this one's tricky, but it's accurate. Imagination. Future and past is a form of imagination. If I took your imagination away, you would have no concept, no access. You wouldn't even be able to use your memory to envision things that have happened in the past without imagination. That's why it's so important to the evolution of consciousness is imagination, because that helps us create different things that we can work with, such as time. There's no future without imagination. There's no past without imagination. Of
But
course,
imagination could be a trap of attention if you have an established presence.
well, both of these can be our traps. The way that
Because you
we're
can
talking about them,
imagine a scenario of doom. That's what worry is,
Sure.
really, right? Isn't
Oh,
that a
yeah.
form of imagination?
It is. Yeah. All forms of anxiety that the body hasn't learned, because you can have a bodily response, but it learned that. But it came from a form of, so people who don't like imagination are like, oh, I don't know, you're doing it anyway. You're always imagining shit. If you're not engaging the present moment cognitively, what are you doing? You exist, right? You're there. Like I can poke you, right? You're a human, you exist. What is your mind doing? It's very likely engaging one, if not both of those bubbles. You're thinking about the past, and the past exists as a part of your imagination. So people are engaging their imagination all the time anyway.
So is the future.
And so is the future, of course. Yeah. Does this make sense? All the problems, all the things that you're thinking about, that's not a part of your present moment necessarily until you create it in a bubble of thought. So your mind, everybody listening to this, is doing one of three things, sometimes all, sometimes not, but you're either engaging the world around you and inside of you, your bubble of perception. If you had no senses, if you had no peripheral nervous system, you're in a darkness, just a darkness of nothing. Or you're thinking, or you're imagining something. And usually the way that people imagine below the threshold of active recognition is imaginary scenarios, which is one of our traps of thinking, or they're creating psychological time, which is all a form of imagination. Those are the three primary aspects of human cognition. Now, of course, we have logic, reason, deduction, but that's all in the present moment. The only way that you can entertain logic yesterday is imagination and thought. The only way that you can, consider your third grade teacher is with imagination or thought. The only way that you can consider what you're going to do tomorrow, what you're going to do in 5 minutes, what you've ever done ever, would be imagination and thought. That's the two things that can potentially remove us from our bubble of immediate perception. I don't think my cup has a bubble of perception because there's no sensory organs, there's no peripheral nervous system. So as far as I know, this inanimate object does not have that bubble of perception. Humans do. All forms of life to some extent do. Remember I talked about walking up to that little sea creature, and I knew that it could perceive the world around it, but it didn't have eyes. If you touched it, it got really small, so it has tactile sensory perception. But I don't know what else it's doing. I don't know how else it senses the world around it. It does in some way, but sharks have other ways of sensing the world. Whales have different ways of sensing the world. Birds have different ways of sensing the world. Humans have different ways of sensing the world. That's your bubble of perception. Birds are not in thought bubbles. Most animals are not engaging these two bubbles to the extent that they do. Would I list what again, Jerry? What did you need listed again?
I don't know if I caught it for sure, if it was 2 or 3 things. You said these are the things that we're never not doing, thought or imagination. Is it 2 or was there a third? It's those 2. Okay.
But you also mentioned imaginary scenarios.
That would be imagination. Mm-hmm.
I thought that's what she was mentioning when you said imaginary scenario. You said a couple of things under that.
Oh,
that I wrote imaginary scenarios down, and you said something else. I didn't catch that either, so I thought that's maybe what Jerry was.
I mean, anything that would involve a psychological time is probably.
Yeah, psychological time. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I say psychological time, but all time is psychological. The observation of cause and effect.
So the things that you're listing as what the common mind does that takes up space in the bubble of perception that prevents presence are really similar things. This is when we get into the duality, are very similar things that if we've established presence, we use that deliberately, and then they are no longer things that clog the space, but engage the space.
Exactly. Eventually, we'll use thought and imagination to emphasize our bubble of perception. So
well, that's what we were just talking about in deliberate modulation of
exactly what we were talking
energy.
About. Exactly what we're talking about. Yeah.
So with presence, once this presence is established, so that's why it's hard to answer a question brought to the group or anyone. It's hard to answer a question from a point of hydrostasy or from a point of in a different phase of the practice if presence hasn't been established first. That's
Exactly.
the whole point of the whole bridge system.
That's the whole point.
Engaging the present. So there are fundamental building blocks that if they're not in place, that's why before you were saying points of attention, internal and external, and breath and thought. It's because all of those things exist in the human experience. So you have to pick them. You don't have to. I know that I was existing predominantly in the thought, imagination, energy space, because it's what I like. But I was not focused in the physical, my feet, my breath, which is why you suggested, which you rarely ever do, suggest anything, was a physical practice that was more deliberate, because I was in the emergency room twice. I got a concussion. And here I'm practicing. I'm remembering more than 50% of the time, and I'm still tripping on things or falling on things because my presence wasn't rooted in balance. I mean, I can't believe the upper dantian, the middle dantian, and the lower dantian, which I am engaging all the time now, is like, it's miraculous to me. Like the amount of space I'm creating the amount of space I am able to engage is so much more balanced now. And this is after 5 years of practicing. I used to skip those things going, yeah, I don't like those. I like to pick my lowest hanging fruit. I like to pick the stuff that I like. I like to pick the magical stuff. I like to pick and it wasn't balanced. And I couldn't progress in my practice without doing that for just exactly what you explained. If it's rooted in an imbalanced way, I don't have to do it. There was definitely more peace. There was more space. I was practicing this practice, but I couldn't progress with it, or I was stumbling. It was really bumpier than it needed to be. It was like a chair with one leg missing. Like I could reinforce those 3 legs, but I have to balance on that chair in a certain way in order not to fall down. And if I engage the other leg, then I have more balance and then I could move forward. So that's when the duality in explaining the practice becomes more prominent, because everything you just explained about the things that can hold you back, if it's not deliberate, if it's not in if it's not deliberate in this moment, then it's occupying that space in your brain that allows nothing else to get in. If you're deliberately engaging, then the imagination and what did you have? I even forgot what the bubbles were, but those are the very things that we were talking about with deliberate modulation and sensing energy. So it might seem like at an earlier phase of the practice that you just told me that that stuff's no good. Why are you telling me to do that now? Because presence has been established.
Yeah, and it's never not good, it's just out of balance.
Right.
Yeah, and eventually though, Donna, thought, if we're creating balance, will be balanced with overall cognition, right? So we would just have a cognitive bubble and the bubble of perception. And that cognitive bubble, so dolphins with humor. When I deliver warrior training, I will deliver the traps of thinking. I'll also deliver what I view as the results of human evolution. One of them is humor. Interesting thing about humor, if you're in your moment right now, somebody is walking and they slip on a banana and you laugh. You didn't need words. There was no joke, no verbal joke, but yet you still laughed. So humor does not need words. Words can create humor, right? But it's not dependent on it. So they're not the same thing. They don't rely on one another to exist. Does that make sense? And you don't really have to imagine anything because you just saw it. That's what's making you laugh. Now, if you think about it later, it may make you laugh again, but that's engaging your imagination because you're removed from that act, that moment where the person slipped on the banana. Does that make sense, Lauren? So humor is an aspect of human evolution. I think it's something that is something we should embrace to a certain extent, just like imagination, just like music.
Folly.
What do you mean?
Just like folly.
I don't know. Oh, you muted yourself.
How do you differentiate humor from folly?
The way that I understand the word folly is kind of just doing things for fun, just kind of being silly, but it's not necessarily funny, you know?
I'm kind of thinking of the dolphin.
Oh, yeah. But the dolphin has had a lot of time to evolve. So its brain has evolved to the point where it can recognize and create humor. It doesn't need words to do it, doesn't need language to do it. It can happen inside the present moment. However, outside of the moment, you need thought or you need imagination. You need to imagine the person. You don't just laugh for no reason. You imagine something, you see something, you feel. If you just start giggling for absolutely no reason, people think that's creepy for a reason. Because it's like something internally is going on a little bit weird. And then people will start laughing, but they're thinking of something or they're imagining something funny. Does that make sense?
What's the dolphin bit you're talking about?
Lauren interjected, what are dolphins doing with humor? Because we can see aspects of human cognition in other animals, but not in some. So you see excellent memory with elephants, for example. We see language with dolphins, with elephants now. I think they have started to map out a language between elephants. Shayna told me that. But dolphins and whales, they have complex cognition because they've had longer to evolve. So very likely they can do some of the things that humans can do in terms of our humor, maybe even the ability to connect, love without judgment.
So there's no good.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I didn't know if there was some study or something that because you're saying specifically humor. I know that dolphins have cognition. I know they use they have forms of communication with sonar and sound waves. But humor is like I didn't get it. It was for, I'm like, how do you know, how
I
has it been
don't.
observed that dolphins have humor, or they've
I
been
don't.
laughing at jokes or some thought?
I think because of the way that they behave, we think it's humorous. We think that's what's occurring, because they'll fuck with you.
Because
Like
they're playful.
they're
Okay, I got
playful.
you.
Yeah.
They're
And they'll
playful.
mess with you and they'll even laugh. Like it looks like they're laughing.
Yeah, they look like they're laughing.
Yeah.
Understood.
Now they may not be though. I don't know. That's the
Right, that's what I'm saying. I think that it's noteworthy that we look at elephants or dolphins, or we're looking at it from a perspective of, well, they've had plenty of time to evolve, so they can be closer to us, the most evolved.
Or we're
So
closer to them.
I don't
Yeah.
necessarily see it that way. I think that, you know how sometimes with a baby we do silly things and it makes them laugh, and it's because our cognition is so much more developed than their cognition. And I don't see that's necessarily so with some animal species. Their cognition, their ability to use their brain in different ways, I don't want to even say cognition, may be far advanced to ours, like sonar, or it may be far advanced to ours. So when you watch the clip of the little girl doing cartwheels in the aquarium, and the dolphin does cartwheels, and then everybody laughs, and then the dolphin looks like it's laughing, it could be doing what we do to a little baby. They could be just screwing with us, and they're far more evolved, but you know what, they're swimming in this aquarium, and they might as well engage with the people outside of, like, they're not getting it, and this is where I live now, so they're just adapting. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't think it's necessarily me being superior to them.
Oh no.
They could be just
It's just
playing
different.
with me like I do with a baby.
Well, and it's also just evolution. It's just change over time, relative to that species. So different species will develop different things. Of course, we can only use our own cognition as a frame of reference in comparison to other forms of cognition.
Sure, it's all relative.
It's
Yeah.
all relative, yeah. But I would never say that humans are more evolved than anything else, because look at us. I mean, as a species, we're fucking stupid. Like, there's nothing evolved about the way that we're behaving. So whether our cognition is more evolved or not, we're acting like idiots on this planet. There's no getting around that. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it for anybody. The human species is absolutely dysfunctional. It's destroying what it needs to exist. So that is fundamentally dysfunctional. It makes absolutely no sense. So I would never for a second say that humans are more advanced. I don't look at it that way, more or less. It's just different. The dolphin has had opportunity over millions of years to go a different direction because they're underwater relative to their environment. I don't need sonar. I don't get in the water, so I don't need sonar. That wouldn't make any sense for me to have sonar if I'm not, in the water, because that's what sonar's for, is in the water. So no, I would never look at it as better or worse, but we do look at other animals and we're like, oh, that seems relatable, so that seems like something I can relate to. What's occurring, how does that? And so the main way that applies is animals are almost never in thought bubbles or imagination that removes them from the present moment so much that they could get into the dysfunctional habits that human beings do. Unless they really try to imitate us, and then they're just imitating our stupidity. That would be weird.
There's
William has a need for sonar.
there's an old, I think it's Inuit. It's something about the Eskimos, and the whale, hunting a whale to feed the village.
Mhm.
And the hunter's job. That's what everybody had their own job. They coexisted as equals, and everybody had a functioning part of their community. And there was a story, and it was a really great story that emulated that depicted what you do in the perception of the hawk, but it was from the whale's perspective. And they said the fishermen would say that they are fishing and they have certain skills at getting the whale and bringing it back in, and how they cut it up and distribute it and whatever. And it feeds the village for a year. And they use all aspects of the whale, etc. However, the skill in catching the whale was just in waiting for it and being peaceful and making their mind, making their mind very still. And it was a beautifully written story that I'm butchering to death with my words and my accent. But it was about how they waited for it was like a mental telepathy, for lack of a better word, a communication with the whale in the absence of thought. I need to feed my village. And the whale had a more evolved sense of the continuity of life than the human did. But the whale, a whale from a school of whales would voluntarily, it was a folk story, would voluntarily sacrifice itself. So it would make itself available for the fishermen to catch, to feed the family, because it knew it was just going to become part of everything. And then, whatever happens in transition, and it's part of the life cycle. And the whale's awareness of the life cycle and death as an advisor and not being something to avoid, and they could transcend the instinct of survival for the greater good. And so they would make themselves available to the fishermen, and then the fishermen, because the fishermen could feed a village for a year, and the whale participated in that process. And it was very interesting to me because it really made me think about, it was beautifully written and it was a lovely story, but it also made me think about my own perception. Like in this discussion, we're assuming that the dolphin, is imitating us, and maybe it understands humor and maybe it doesn't, maybe it's just copycatting, but we're thinking about it from our perception. And we're like using a transparency to put our perception over what is happening. And it may be something entirely different, and it might be superior in many ways than to the way we're looking at it, but who knows? It's the perception of the hawk. So there's really there's no inherent value in doing that. As a matter of fact, if it gets in the way of us being present in the moment and just establishing some connection in the presence with this other species, then it's taking us away from anything we could glean from it anyway. It becomes those bubbles again that you put in those circles that you put in the bubbles of perception.
Yeah. And I have a fickle relationship with the word superior, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Advanced, more evolved.
Just different. You can't look at evolution as more or less, because evolution is just change over time. So there's no such thing as good evolution or bad evolution. You're either changing over time or you're not. And if you're
adapting to the current circumstances or not.
That's it. Yep. So I think that cognition can make an animal more adaptable. In the human example, our cognition is making us less adaptable because of those two bubbles of perception are being overemphasized. And so look at your day. Look at yourself. Look at your day. Where is your mind? It's in one of those three spots. So if you're paying attention to your emotions, that's your bubble of perception. If you're paying attention to the drive, that's your bubble of perception. If you're thinking about what you want to have for dinner, what is right, what is wrong, who's the best political candidate, what was funny that you heard last week, that is either imagination or thought. The only way that you can remove yourself, your cognition, and your attention from the present moment is to engage two cognitive bubbles called thought and imagination. That's all you're ever doing. So we look at the human experience and it looks so complex and it looks so grandiose and it's like, oh, I can never understand. No, you're doing one of these three things at all times. You're either doing it above or below the threshold of active recognition, maybe a little bit of both if you're in a counterbalance phase of the training. But this whole system just takes our mind back, puts us above the threshold of active recognition, and allows us to balance our mind to where we're engaging the world around us and we're not removed from the present moment. So the thought bubble becomes cognition bubble, and imagination is inside of the cognition bubble, and the bubbles start to balance one another. So logic, reason, deduction, inference are impossible outside of the present moment without thought or imagination. So if you want to think about what was logical last week, 100 years ago, what's the most logical course of action tomorrow when we go to the meet? All of that requires thought or imagination. You can be logical, reasonable, deduce, and infer in the present moment without words. But it has to be in the present moment. Otherwise, you cannot access those aspects of your cognition without thought or without imagination. Those two elements are what people are doing all the time. They're in their imaginary scenarios, their imaginary problems, their imaginary this, their imaginary that, and they're thinking all the time. That is a form of interference. That interference interferes with the flow, the evolution, the change over time. It affects everything. And it's the ultimate source of imbalance in the human experience and is eroding us at the very core of our being. And it cuts us off from the second attention. The human species in general loves to talk about spirituality. They love to say the word spiritual. They like to do things that they view as spiritual, such as collect crystals or go to church. However, feeling, connecting with the unknown, the unseen, that's different. That has an active element because you are feeling something right now, as opposed to just conceptually entertaining something. That's different. That's a thought bubble. Does that make sense? I've never heard anybody describe it quite this way, so I don't have anybody to credit with the view of overall experience in terms of the bubble of perception and the two primary bubbles that humans create. Out of our cognition, those are the two primary bubbles that we create. Typically, we create psychological time with our imagination. We don't really do much else with it when we're below the threshold of active recognition. We do imaginary scenarios, and it's like I imagine myself punching my boss because they're a real asshole, or I imagine myself retired without a care in the world, and I'm just sitting on the beach. And Abraham Hicks told me that if I imagine it and think about it, eventually I'll get there. Sorry, Donna. I did that on purpose. I just threw that in there for you. All I got to do is think about being on the beach, and then all the problems in the world just disappear. No. No. You can be on the beach in the lap of luxury, and 8,000 people, or no, it's like 20 something thousand people can still die in an earthquake, whether you're aware of it or not. And your lack of caring and compassion doesn't make you a better human being. At least lack of caring.
Or even your overwhelming caring and compassion doesn't make you.
That's an opposite imbalance. You're right. Yep. So sometimes I would look at the way that people approach the law of attraction as absolutely putting your head in the sand and pretending that things don't exist because it's not in your alignment. You attracted the earthquake because you saw it on the news. It was everywhere. Like, it was on the news. You got text alerts. Like, it's pretty hard to miss a 200, like when that tsunami killed over 200,000 people. Nobody manifested that. That was the result of tectonic plates under the ocean that displaced the water that caused a tsunami. We're on a planet that is changing, and we need to be able to adapt to it. Well, guess what? Building your cities on the coast doesn't make you very adaptable now, does it? And it's because of the narrow perspective that humans have, because they're in this little thing in their brain. Like, and I was talking to, I think William was the one who was like, hey, wait a second, like, mine's much bigger. Like, there's more space than that. Or I was telling somebody that, and they're like, the space isn't so small, Ernest. But, jokes aside, it's a very tiny little thing going on in your mind called a synaptic connection. That's where your problem exists. That's where the things that aren't going right for you, all of that shit, it all just exists right in here in a little bubble of thought that's like, poof, and it's gone. That's where people are spending their lives. All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns about any of this? So ultimately, we deliberately modulate, and the way that we sense energy, and we'll develop this more, is to engage, enlarge, and occupy your bubble of perception. And that will lead to what I call the axis of hydrostasy. That's the final technique that I will offer. Two primary techniques that I myself do throughout the day, all day, constantly checking into them. They might make sense because one comes from Tai Chi, the 3 treasures. I'm aware of 3 treasures at all times throughout my day. I deliberately modulate to that, sense into that in my own body, and then what I call the axis of hydrostasy. Those are that's where I exist. And what I'm bringing out with the second attention is a hypothesis that the human species at a certain point started to go away from the spirit of things, the non-seen, we love to talk about it. We love to create memes about it. We love to just completely make shit up and throw that on the internet. We love to do that. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about spirit being an aspect of your cognition as a second attention all throughout the day. That will completely alter your lens of perception and completely change your life experience in ways that are unpredictable, but that will lend towards the overall evolution of yourself and the human species. Does that make sense? And I believe, I think William mentioned this last week, but I do believe that Qigong is the missing aspect of traditional Chinese medicine. And I believe that allowing other types of thought and new information is the missing aspect of traditional Chinese medicine. They didn't have an endocannabinoid system then. They hadn't invented electricity then. There's a lot of aspects of the human being that we didn't know about. So we have to continue to descriptions change as knowledge increases. That should be the case with traditional Chinese medicine as well. But in a lot of ways, it's so traditional that it's sometimes for some people, it's not changing at all. And I think that's an error as well.
That's why I challenge you when you say, and that's the last thing I'm going to teach. That's the last thing I have to offer. It's no, it's not.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will probably continue to offer ways to get there. I'll share techniques. Maybe some could be relatable, some aren't, because there's aspects of deliberate modulation that I can't share. It's my life, like it's my memory, it's my way to get there. There's some I can share because it's a part of the whole practice. So finding the peace, finding a calm attitude, finding a balanced emotional, you can do that just like I can do that. So that's a shared experience. It's going to be more common for people who practice this. So that's one that we share, but there's a point where I just can't talk about it anymore. And I don't feel comfortable talking about it because now we're dividing up the infinite. And then before you know it, we're trying to conceptualize and put in a box something that is infinite and can never be in a box. And one of those boxes is language, concept, and understanding. So there's some aspects of our experience
So the different techniques may change, and the techniques might not
yeah.
have a lot of words associated or any words associated.
Yep, and I can
with it,
admit
they're still
that.
shareable. Whether you choose to share them or not is entirely up to you, but there will always be something to share.
There will always be something to share. I agree. In terms of the Qigong practice, it ends when a person is able to feel the second attention, because that's non-interference. When a person is at a point of non-interference, I shouldn't interfere with them, right? Because they've gotten out of their own way. They're going to create how they see fit. But those 4 elements will be there. You know, someone is like, Ernest, I'm in hydrostasy. You can't judge me. I'm going to go do what I want. That's fine. Is there a peaceful mind? Is there a calm attitude? Is there a balanced emotional state? Is there impeccable self-awareness? Are you engaging the bubble of perception? If all of those are yes, then you're right. I got nothing really to offer, because you're going to go explore relative to your temperament, rather relative to the totality of your experience. You'll do different things. I'm going to do acupuncture because I have this vision in my mind of having a little medicine kit, and it's like a little bag, and I open it, I press a little button and it opens up, and I have my herbs and I have my needles and I have my alcohol and I have all the little different things, and I can do house calls. And a part of your acupuncture treatment, I will make available Qigong, Yigong, and other aspects of traditional Chinese medicine. So do you really want to get to the root of the issue? That's Yigong. Do you want to get to the root of the body and how it's flowing? That's Qigong, Tai Chi. All right. See you, William. Thank you. Any questions about any of that stuff? And it's all a part of the Qigong system. So if I talk about Qigong, it's a part of Qigong. If I talk about Tai Chi, it's a part of Qigong. If I talk about posture, it's a part of the Qigong practice. So I will never remove the cognitive element. That's always first. So that's why I'll do Qigong in later layers of the practice, because first we got to focus on Qigong. Where is the mind and did we put it there? That's number one at all times ever. If you're going to do Qigong, where's your mind and did you put it there in the first place? So you can't do Qigong without Qigong. That doesn't make sense. They just don't, people just haven't talked about it quite the way that I do. But remember, the child thinks about their mother, they miss their mother, that displaces chi, that gives them a tummy ache. They continue to think the same way, that creates patterns of behavior. The patterns of behavior also displace chi, and that leads to long-term illness and sickness. Does that make sense? And then that long-term illness and sickness will perpetuate more illness and sickness because it will perpetuate more habits. And they get out of balance because we're not paying attention to them. We're not doing anything with them. We're just allowing habits to go untethered. So logically, if it's gotten to that point, let's do some acupuncture to help regain the balance. Let's do some cupping to help regain the balance. But we still have to look at the mind, so that we stop missing the person in the first place, or creating the emotion that displaces the chi, that displaces the body, that displaces the chi. Does that make sense? So if we don't address our cognition, we're literally just putting a Band-Aid on a broken dam, like a dam that has a ginormous crack in it and it's just about to break and flood, and we're just going to stick a little Band-Aid on it and call it Qigong. I'm not into Band-Aids. I'm into altering the lens of perception. All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns about this? All right. So next week it gets a little bit interesting, I guess, because we will get into the 5 destroyers. We'll get into the enemies of knowledge, the hydrostatic effect. That's a feeling that can be felt, and that's where we start to, that's the foundation of behavioral change. The foundation of behavioral change is not creating the multiplicity of self, a better self, a future self, the self I want to be, the self that I'm not. That's leaking power. We don't need to do any of that. Pay attention. How do you feel? How does this act make you feel? Is it going away or is it going towards? The moment that you pay attention to the act of a habit, it becomes the act of choice. And then eventually the choice won't feel good, the habit won't feel good, and as personal power grows, the habit will drop. It is directly proportional to personal power growing, though. That's all we focus on really, is growing personal power by doing our practice, intention, and will. Does that make sense?
It does. And when you do not focus on becoming a better self, a more improved self, or at least you're not measuring it all the time. It's, am I present? Am I present? Where's my feet? Where's my, where are my 4 directions? Where are my 4 modes? What dissolves, it dissolves that ego self, focusing on self. And then when the focus on self becomes less of a motivating factor, it occupies less space in your brain. Then othering kind of goes along with it, because you're not trying to get someone else to perceive you as a better or to correct a misperception on the other person. It's like they're I can't do anything about their lens of perception, and nor do I want to, because it takes me away from my presence. That's it.
And it's a form of interference. You're attempting to interfere with somebody else, which is what most people are doing with their behavior, is they want people to perceive them a certain way. That is a form of interference, manipulation, and control. You're right.
Yeah. But you can't focus on what not to do. You can just notice when it happens. Oh, look, I'm doing this. And what is that about? It's about self. It always stems back to, I am scorekeeping where I am. You don't have to declare war on anything. You don't have to not do anything. You don't have to try to dissolve your ego. Just, where's your presence? What are you doing to establish presence? And then the clarity comes from that. It's not, it's not the backwards way. It's not about dissolving, getting rid of, stop doing this, stop doing that.
It's just all about balance at a certain point.
Yes, and you can't declare war on it because we're at different phases of the practice at different points. I might have a battleground that brings me back to an earlier phase of my practice. I drop my hydrostasy practice because I'm triggered by a place where there's a lot of habit and momentum, and I can only notice that in the moment because I'm being present. So I don't have to declare war on any of it. I don't have to say, oh, crap, look at that. It'll make itself apparent. Like I'll fall down because I'm not paying attention to my feet. I'll trip, I'll spill something. It'll be apparent, or I'll feel the pull away from the present moment.
Yeah.
And then what do I do with that? I establish, what do I do? What am I doing? Not what am I not doing? What do I have to stop doing? What am I doing to establish to go back? That's what go back to the practice means when we say go back to the practice, go back to the practice. How do I do this? What if I do that? How do I accomplish this? How do I go back to the practice is always the answer. It's always the answer.
By
What
the
am I
way,
doing?
whenever somebody says go back to the practice, for me, that means rule of three. Because if we have to go back, we went away. If we went away with what? Words and imagination. It's the only two ways that you ever went away in the first place. So we have to use the rule of three that includes words and other points of attention. So it can't be too many words when we're already using too many words, because you don't just shut off thought.
Right, but the words, everything you just said is not in the direction of what you're trying to accomplish. It's about presence. The rule of three is here, not about what your goal is. So
Right.
not declaring war on goals.
Well, the only way that you can declare war is with a thought bubble or with imagination.
Right.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're in the present moment. You're engaging it. You're doing something with it. And that's the gist of this practice, is to create, well, you've already created it, is to engage, emphasize, and maintain the bubble of perception, which is your life experience, which is where it's actually happening, which is where everything to learn happens. So if we go away from the practice, we went away from it in thought or an imagination that removed us from the bubble of perception. Does that make sense? And the mind is always, at least to some degree, below the threshold of active recognition. So we don't want to be doubly below. Does that make sense? It's always below anyway. We want to make sure that we're always above at the same time. Always above and below, the two combined together, and we get impeccable self-awareness. What most human beings are is they have a below the threshold, and then they're doubly below the threshold. And that is the imbalance of the human existence, the human species currently, is they're doubly below. And they think that they have to just be fully above, and that just doesn't exist either. We always have a combination of the two. We don't declare war on habits. We'll never not have a habit ever. No, the brain does it. The brain creates habit. Our job is to be aware of it so that we can feel it before it starts to go out of balance, which will create sickness. It will create trouble cognitively, physically, and can help create the conditions for suffering for people around us. So establish emphasis, maintain emphasis. Establish attention on the second attention, the abstract, maintain attention on the abstract. That's all we're doing. And that abstract element is where all the quality is. So, yeah. Shayna took that picture on her thing. I think it's like a piece of wood on the lake. That wasn't her normal perspective. She's not 2 inches tall, right? She found that perspective as a point of quality. And that's what we're finding in every moment, in all moments when we're in the second attention. So even if things don't go your way, you're still finding that quality edge, that artist's edge.
And when we can see that in the moment, that it's happening fully, and you're having those observations or experiences. I can't even say they're observations because they're felt, they're not seen necessarily. Taking a snapshot of it reminds you of all those points of attention, reminds you of that's deliberate modulation. I was walking on the beach and I was walking on the boardwalk and I was populating my bubble of perception, and it was an evolving creative endeavor, which I recognize to a large degree I can do, I believe I can do on the boardwalk more than I can. So on my walk to the boardwalk, I was like, why am I not doing it now? Like, why am I not doing it? And why do I save it for when my feet hit the boardwalk? Of course I'm practicing, but to that degree, the degrees of engagement. And I was, I don't know, I had my points of attention. I was involved in my space. There are a lot of people that walk along the boardwalk. Everybody's very friendly. And so I moved my gaze in the other direction, and I was engaging my points of attention that I had chosen that day. And a person looked at me, and we both smiled. We made eye contact and smiled. And that happens a million times. But this particular moment, I had a thought. I had a thought of what a happy, loving smile. Like, it felt like that person's smile was very present, very engaged, and very coming from within. I just felt an energy about it that was more so than the obligatory smile hello that other people had while their minds were occupied. It was a presence that I felt in that person, that may have been momentary, or maybe the way he walks through the planet, I don't know. And as I passed, since I have decided to make a snapshot of that moment because it had a feeling associated with it. And I deliberately modulate to that and sense that energy, which was peaceful and loving and connected and present. I didn't look and see what time it was so that I could go, maybe that guy walks on the beach at that time and I can go meet him again, or I wonder if he's single, or I didn't have all that other crap that goes along with all of that. And it is a point. It's like Shayna's snapshot. That's all I want to say. It's something that I will deliberately modulate to. It was a connection. I felt like he had a lot of connection going on at that moment, and we just happened to pass each other and look up and smile, but that there was a whole bunch else going on, because there was a whole bunch else going on for me. I was engaging this space. It felt like another human being was doing that. But the feeling associated with it is something that I deliberately modulate and engage, and because of the energy that I felt at that moment from the totality of what I was populating my bubble of perception with. So I don't know if that experience sounds right to you in terms of how you explain what deliberate modulation, sensing energy is.
It sounds like it qualifies. And can you imagine trying to put that into writing as a practice for someone else to follow?
I have another moment where a bird was just, the wind was coming from different directions and he could actually stay still, almost still in the air, because he could, the aerodynamics of what he was doing while he was looking at, possible piece of food, or, or just, I don't know, enjoying the air, whatever the hell he was doing. I don't know. He has his own perception, but that it felt similar to that. So those are things that I've made a snapshot of in my mind that I can deliberately modulate to and remember all of those points of attention that allowed me to sense the energy of
Mhm.
that moment.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I'm just going to add this to the whiteboard, just because. Let's see, can I paste? Nope, I can't cut and copy. Okay, never mind. But yeah, so I'll save this picture, even though I've done it before. This picture is so important because this is what you're doing with your mind, whether you like it or not. This is what the mind is doing. So the key.
But are you doing it deliberately?
Yeah, so it's going to do it or not. You know, you have attention, whether it's deliberate or not. You have those bubbles, whether they're deliberate or not. You're interacting with all three bubbles pretty much all of the time to some extent, just not deliberately, intentionally, and willfully, unless you're doing this practice or a practice that's somewhat similar. But yeah. All right, so I will see you guys on Thursday for group study, and then we'll go into the next topic, which is the 5 destroyers. So that should be fun. Or it is terrifying, and you can save that one and come and maybe rewatch it on YouTube. I don't know. All right, so with the destroyers, just remember they're the ones that are typically holding the kite string. When I talk about the masters of attention, I don't mean people. The masters of attention typically for the common society, for the ordinary cognition, it's the 5 destroyers that are holding the kite string, not the person. They're not holding their own kite string. They're not the ones guiding the kite in the sky. It is the 5 destroyers. So it paints a grim picture because it paints a grim picture. It is what it is. I mean, if that dynamic continues, we will end up with a planet that is almost entirely uninhabitable. For humans, at least. Plants will be okay. They can have carbon dioxide of what, like 11,000 to 20,000 parts per million, which is a whole lot more than a human, like whole lot more than a human. So yeah, it won't necessarily equal no life on Earth, but the human species is going to have a very hard time adapting unless some of these changes that we're talking about are made. It's micro and macro. It's the way to individual peace and evolution change over time. And it is also the way that the species can find peace and change over time. But we really have to understand the dynamics of human cognition and the human experience. And I can guarantee that almost nobody is looking at it quite like this, because I've never heard this before. This stuff has all come to me from a hydrostatic state. So I can see what's occurring. I'm like, I can see my mind is either in these places or it's not. I can't be anywhere else. Like, that is the human experience. Okay. All right. So I will see you guys again on Thursday if you can make it. Nothing on Sunday. And then when these topics are finished, we go to just Thursday. If Thursday needs to change because of classes, I start classes in May, and it is a pretty intense schedule. It's the doctorate program, so it's got quite a lot going on. I think I'm going to do really good at it. Like, I don't think it's going to be hard. I mean, it will be time consuming. I'll have to put in a lot of effort, a lot of energy, but I doubt very seriously that they're going to stump me too much that I'm just like, I don't know how to do this. So I'll still be able to. The reason I'm telling you that is because I'll still be able to do the group study and stuff. I just might have to change the day or something like that, but still going to be able to do all my writing and stuff because I do that pretty slow anyway. So
You don't know the schedule of that yet?
I do have my schedule. I'll organize it and I can send the schedule so you have an idea. Mondays are just completely inaccessible for me. Mondays is the longest day of the week for me. Yeah. All right. Well, I will see you guys again soon if you can make it on Thursday. All right. Bye, everyone. And I'll post the video and I'll post the, especially that first whiteboard for you to look at. All right. Yep. You're welcome. See you guys.